On a quiet Texas morning, a 16-year-old boy sent his drone over a patch of woods near his grandfather's farm. He didn't know those trees were cartel territory. By nightfall, he was gone. And the man they thought was just a retired farmer was sharpening the same blade he used in Fallujah. Quick pause before we continue. Tell us where in the world you're watching from, and hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story is absolutely mind-blowing. The sun hadn't yet burned through the morning mist when Roy Carson stepped onto his porch, coffee in hand. At 68, he kept the same routine he'd maintained for decades. Up before dawn, check the livestock, tend to the land that stretched endlessly toward the Mexican border. This wasn't just habit, it was discipline forged in the mountains of Afghanistan and the deserts of Iraq, where routine meant survival. Roy's weathered hands gripped the porch rail as he surveyed his property. 40 years of farming had carved deep lines in his face, but his eyes remained sharp as a sniper's scope. Those same eyes that once scanned Afghan mountainsides for Taliban movement now watched over cattle and cornfields with the same tactical awareness. Old habits die hard, especially when they've kept you alive through 3 combat deployments. The Carson Ranch sprawled across 400 acres of prime Texas real estate, just 12 miles from the Mexican border. Roy had bought it with his military pension and savings, thinking the isolation would bring peace. What he hadn't counted on was how the border had changed over the decades. What used to be quiet smuggling routes had become highways for cartels moving everything from drugs to weapons to human cargo. His grandson Liam was visiting for the summer, a city kid from Dallas who'd never seen a sunrise without skyscrapers. The boy was fascinated by the wide open spaces, constantly filming everything with his new drone, a $1,000 piece of technology that Roy secretly found impressive, even if he'd never admit it. Liam had arrived 2 weeks ago, all gangly limbs and teenage energy, excited to spend the summer learning about real ranch life. Roy had been enjoying the company more than he'd expected. After his wife Martha passed 5 years ago, the ranch had felt too quiet, too empty. Having Liam around brought life back to the old house, even if the kid couldn't milk a cow to save his life and thought eggs came from factories. At 6:30 a.m., Roy heard the familiar whir of rotors. Liam was already up, piloting his drone over the property like some kind of teenage Air Force commander. The boy appeared around the corner of the barn, controller in hand, eyes glued to his tablet screen with the intensity of a gamer in a championship match. "Morning, Grandpa. You gotta see this footage. I caught something really cool near those woods by the South Ridge. This truck just sitting there in the middle of nowhere. Looks like it's got some kind of artwork on the sides." Roy set down his coffee mug, his entire body going rigid. The casualness in Liam's voice made it worse somehow. The boy had no idea what he might have stumbled onto. Roy took the tablet with hands that had defused IEDs and fired sniper rifles, now trembling slightly as he watched his grandson's innocent footage. There, clear as day, was a black pickup truck with distinctive markings along the side. Not artwork, cartel tags. The same symbols he'd seen painted on walls in Kandahar, when different enemies used different methods but carried the same deadly intent. Los Hermanos Sangrientos, the Blood Brothers cartel. Roy recognized their markings from intelligence briefings he'd received during his final deployment, when his unit had been tasked with interdicting weapons shipments heading south. "Delete that footage, Liam. Right now." The urgency in Roy's voice made Liam look up from the screen. "What? Why? It's just some old truck." "Delete it. All of it." "But Grandpa, I already uploaded it to my cloud storage. It's automatic. The app backs everything up as soon as I land the drone. I can't really delete it from everywhere, it's already on like 3 different servers." Roy's hand gripped the tablet tighter, his knuckles white against the black case. His grandson had just broadcast the location of a cartel operation to the internet. Even if the footage seemed innocent, the wrong people had algorithms constantly scanning for exactly this kind of intelligence. They'd know within hours, maybe less. "Son, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Stay close to the house today. Don't go past the fence line. Don't fly that drone again. And if anyone comes to the property, anyone at all, you run to the storm cellar and you stay there until I come get you." Liam had never heard that tone from his grandfather. The easygoing farmer who taught him to fish and told stories about the old days was gone, replaced by something harder, more dangerous. Something that reminded Liam of the action movies he wasn't supposed to watch, except this was real and sitting across from him at the breakfast table. "Grandpa, you're scaring me. What's going on?" Roy forced his expression to soften, but his eyes remained alert, already planning. Probably nothing, son. Just being careful. Your grandmother always said I worried too much. But Martha had never known about the classified files Roy kept locked in his office. She'd never known that her husband's farming equipment included night vision goggles and tactical gear hidden behind the fertilizer bags. She'd known he'd served in special operations, but she'd never known the details, the missions that didn't exist on paper, the enemies who'd sworn vengeance against Ghost Team 4, the fact that Roy Carson was still on several kill lists maintained by people who never forgot and never forgave. Roy waited until Liam was inside, supposedly doing online summer school assignments but probably playing video games, before making the call. Sheriff Tom Maddox had been a friend for 20 years, one of the few people who knew pieces of Roy's past. They'd served together in Iraq during Tom's National Guard deployment, before Tom came home to wear a badge instead of battle dress. Tom, it's Roy. You might want to check the South Ridge today. Saw something that doesn't belong. Roy, you know I can't just drive out to your place every time you get paranoid about border jumpers. I've got actual crimes to investigate, budget meetings with the county. This isn't about border jumpers, Tom. Trust me on this one. And Tom? When you go, bring backup. Bring a lot of backup. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Tom knew Roy well enough to recognize when the old soldier was operating on intel rather than instinct. What kind of not belonging are we talking about here, Roy? The kind that carries automatic weapons and doesn't negotiate. Shit. How sure are you? Sure enough to make this call. Roy hung up and walked to the barn. In the back corner, hidden behind stacks of feed bags and covered by a tarp that looked like it had been there for decades, was a steel box he hadn't opened in 15 years. The combination was Martha's birthday, a touch of sentiment in an otherwise cold, practical cache. Inside were things from another life. A purple heart he'd never displayed. Unit patches from operations that were still classified. Dog tags from men who died beside him in places that weren't supposed to exist. A combat knife with a handle worn smooth by years of use. And at the bottom, wrapped in oiled cloth like a religious relic, photographs of Ghost Team 4. 12 men in the photo. Roy knew exactly where each of the other 11 was buried. 3 miles south of the Carson Ranch, Miguel El Lobo Vargas lowered his binoculars and smiled. He'd been tracking the electronic signature of uploaded drone footage for 6 months, part of a sophisticated counter-surveillance operation that the cartel had developed to protect their smuggling routes. When footage of their checkpoint appeared on cloud servers, El Lobo's techs had traced it back to the source within 2 hours. The Carson Ranch. An old man and a teenager, isolated, no significant law enforcement presence for miles. It should have been simple: grab the kid, use him as leverage to ensure the old man's silence, dump the body in the desert when the message was delivered. But El Lobo recognized the name Roy Carson. He'd encountered that name before, in a different desert, during a different war. The American who'd spared his life in Kandahar when he was just a scared 19-year-old Taliban fighter, captured during a raid on a weapons cache. The same American who'd looked him in the eyes and said, "You're just a kid. Go home. Stay home." El Lobo had gone home. For about 6 months. Then he joined the cartel and worked his way up through discipline, intelligence, and a complete willingness to do whatever was necessary. He'd been hoping to never encounter Roy Carson again. Some debts were better left unpaid. But business was business, and the cartel couldn't allow surveillance of their operations. If the old man was the same Roy Carson, this would be interesting. If not, it would be over quickly. El Lobo checked his watch and nodded to his men. Wait for the boy to separate from the house. We take him clean, no witnesses, no noise. The old man cooperates or we send pieces back until he does. The afternoon heat was building toward triple digits when Liam decided he couldn't stand being cooped up inside any longer. Roy was busy with the cattle on the far side of the property, and the woods by the ridge looked perfect for testing his drone's new stabilization software. He'd been working on a project for his summer photography class, aerial shots of Texas landscapes, and his teacher had specifically requested footage of authentic rural environments. Besides, Roy was probably just being paranoid. The old man had been acting strange all morning, constantly checking the windows, adjusting the blinds, even going so far as to move his truck so it faced the road instead of the barn. Liam had grown up in Dallas. He knew what paranoid looked like, and his grandfather was definitely exhibiting the signs. At 1:17 p.m., Liam launched his drone from the ridge overlooking the woods. The footage was perfect, sweeping shots of mesquite trees and desert brush, exactly what his teacher was looking for. He was so focused on piloting the aircraft and monitoring the camera feed that he never noticed the three men who emerged from the tree line behind him. They'd been tracking the drone's electronic signature, following the control signals that led them straight to the operator. Professional kidnappers, specialists in leverage and intimidation. They moved with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this before. Liam saw movement in his peripheral vision and turned just as the first man reached him. He had time to drop the controller and open his mouth to scream before a chemically soaked cloth covered his face and the world went dark. The second man caught the falling drone controller and shut down the aircraft remotely. No witnesses, no evidence, no trail. The third man hoisted Liam's unconscious form over his shoulder and they disappeared back into the woods, leaving only scuff marks in the dirt and a crashed drone as evidence of what had happened. Roy heard the ATV engine die in the distance and felt his blood run cold. Liam was careful with equipment, obsessively so. The kid had never so much as left a video game running, let alone allowed a vehicle to run out of gas. Something was wrong. Roy climbed into his truck and drove toward the ridge, his mind already shifting into tactical mode. Approach vectors, sightlines, potential ambush positions. The landscape transformed from familiar farmland into a combat zone as decades of training reasserted themselves. He found the drone first, smashed against a mesquite tree like it had been swatted out of the sky. The expensive camera housing was cracked, the rotors bent at impossible angles. Roy knelt beside the wreckage and found the controller 20 feet away, its screen spiderwebbed with cracks but still functional. Liam. Roy's voice echoed across the empty fields, carrying the authority of a man who'd commanded troops under fire. The silence that came back was deafening. Roy examined the ground with the methodical precision of a tracker. Boot prints, multiple sets, military-style treads that spoke of tactical footwear. Scuff marks where someone had been dragged. A piece of red fabric caught on a thorn bush, from Liam's t-shirt. At 2 p.m., a burned cell phone landed near the fence post with a metallic thunk. Roy drew his sidearm, a Colt .45 he'd carried for 20 years, and approached carefully. The phone was still smoking, the plastic case melted but recognizable. Liam's phone, customized with stickers from his favorite bands. The message was clear, "We have your boy." But Roy read more in that burned phone than the kidnappers intended. The fact that they'd burned it instead of simply destroying it suggested professional training. The timing of the throw indicated they were still close, still watching. And the choice to make contact this way instead of a traditional ransom call meant they wanted to establish psychological dominance. They'd picked the wrong grandfather. Roy called Sheriff Maddox immediately, his fingers dialing the number from muscle memory, while his eyes continued scanning for threats. Tom, they took him. They took Liam. Roy, slow down. Who took him? What are you talking about? Cartel. Los Hermanos Sangrientos, based on the vehicle markings Liam filmed this morning. Professional snatch and grab, military-trained operators. They have my grandson, and they're using him as leverage. Jesus Christ, Roy. Okay, we need to coordinate with Border Patrol, maybe bring in the feds. This is way beyond local jurisdiction. We'll set up a command post at. How long, Tom? What? How long before you have assets on the ground? How long before someone actually starts looking for my grandson instead of forming committees and filing paperwork? There was a pause. Roy, you know how this works. We have protocols, procedures. We can't just. Roy hung up. He'd waited for backup once before, in another desert, in another war. A village in Afghanistan where intelligence indicated high-value targets were holding American hostages. The chain of command had insisted on coordination, air support, proper authorization. By the time the cavalry arrived, they'd found 3 empty buildings and 4 shallow graves. That wasn't happening again. Not to his blood. Roy returned to the barn and opened the steel box with hands that no longer trembled. Inside were medals he'd never displayed, patches from units that didn't officially exist, and gear he'd thought he'd never need again. At the bottom, wrapped in oiled cloth like a sacred relic, was the combat knife that had saved his life in Fallujah and taken others in places whose names were still classified. As Roy strapped on the shoulder holster, muscle memory took over. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking chambers, testing equipment, preparing for war. The methodical ritual of a professional preparing for combat. Actions performed so many times they become automatic, muscle memory encoded at a cellular level. The grandfather was disappearing, replaced by the operator he'd been for 20 years. Roy Carson, Ghost Team 4, Call Sign Reaper. The man who'd spent 2 decades in places that didn't exist, fighting enemies who weren't supposed to be there, completing missions that never appeared in official records. Ghost Team 4 had been disbanded for a decade, its members scattered to civilian life or early graves. But Roy Carson had never really left the team. He'd just been waiting for the right mission. He opened his gun safe, not the small one Martha had known about, but the professional armory hidden behind a false wall. Inside were weapons that would make a SWAT team jealous, military-grade optics, night vision equipment, tactical gear that was supposedly restricted to active-duty personnel. Roy had kept his clearances current through private security consulting, maintaining access to equipment and intelligence networks that most people assumed were beyond the reach of retired operators. At 2:45 p.m., Roy's secure satellite phone buzzed with an encrypted message from a contact he hadn't spoken to in 5 years. Word traveled fast in the special operations community, and Roy's former teammates maintained an informal network that spanned the globe. Heard you have a problem. Assets available if needed. Phoenix. Roy smiled grimly as he typed back, appreciate the offer. Handling locally. Some missions were personal. Roy accessed Liam's drone backup app on his phone, using the boy's passwords that he'd memorized during their first week together. Liam wasn't particularly creative with security. The last GPS coordinates showed the device had been flying over an abandoned water station 2 miles south, a relic from the days when this area supported more cattle ranching. Roy loaded his truck with supplies that looked innocent to casual observation, but served multiple tactical purposes. Rope for restraints, wire cutters for breaching, bags of fertilizer that could be repurposed into explosives with the right catalyst. To anyone watching, he looked like a farmer heading out to fix fence posts and tend to irrigation equipment. But Roy was building something else entirely. He drove to the water station and found tire tracks leading deeper into the desert, fresh marks in the hardpan dirt, heading toward an old grain silo that had been abandoned since the drought of '98. Roy had driven past that silo countless times over the years, never paying it much attention. Now he studied it with tactical eyes and realized it was perfect for a temporary command post. Good sightlines in all directions, multiple escape routes, defensible position with limited approach vectors. Whoever had chosen this location knew what they were doing. Roy parked his truck a half-mile away and approached on foot, moving with the patience of a hunter and the precision of a sniper. The silo was surrounded by vehicles, 3 pickup trucks and a panel van, all with Mexican plates and the subtle modifications that suggested they were used for more than legitimate transportation. Through his military-grade binoculars, Roy counted at least 6 hostiles, all carrying automatic weapons with the casual familiarity of professionals. Their positioning was good but not perfect. They were thinking like smugglers protecting a shipment, not soldiers defending against military assault. That would be their first mistake. The second mistake was visible through the silo's upper window. They positioned Liam where he could be seen, probably thinking it would deter any rescue attempt. What they didn't understand was that Roy had spent 20 years conducting hostage rescues in environments far more challenging than rural Texas. At 6:45 p.m., Roy spotted movement in the silo's upper window. A flash of red shirt, Liam's shirt. The boy was alive, tied to a chair but breathing, conscious, and apparently unharmed. Roy watched as a man emerged from the building, talking on a satellite phone with the confident posture of someone in command. Roy focused the binoculars on the man's face and felt his blood freeze. Tall, scarred face, moving with military precision. The left side of his face was marked by burn scars that Roy remembered causing with a white phosphorus grenade in a cave complex outside Kandahar. El Lobo, Roy whispered. Miguel Vargas, the scared kid he'd spared in Afghanistan, now grown into a cartel commander who'd sworn vengeance against the Americans who destroyed his Taliban cell. The boy Roy had shown mercy to had grown into a man who showed mercy to no one. Some mercies come back to haunt you. This one had brought war to Roy's doorstep. Roy adjusted his scope and had a clear shot. One squeeze of the trigger and the man responsible for his grandson's kidnapping would be dead. But El Lobo wasn't alone, and killing him might trigger the execution of hostages. Roy had learned patience in the mountains of Afghanistan, and patience was what this situation required. He settled in to watch and wait, planning an assault that would make his old ghost team proud. Roy moved through the desert with the silence of a predator, using terrain features and shadows to mask his approach. The first step was cutting the power line to the silo using a makeshift hook fashioned from tractor chain and insulated wire, a technique he'd learned during urban warfare training in Iraq. The building went dark, and Roy heard confused voices from inside, shouting in rapid Spanish. He'd learned enough of the language during border operations to understand the gist: generator failure, equipment malfunction, no immediate suspicion of outside interference. They were reacting like criminals, not soldiers, which gave Roy a significant tactical advantage. At 7:45 p.m., Roy began his distraction phase. Firecrackers exploded around the perimeter in a carefully orchestrated sequence designed to simulate incoming fire from multiple directions. Smoke grenades fashioned from fertilizer and diesel fuel created a wall of confusion that turned the desert evening into a tactical nightmare for the defenders. The cartel soldiers rushed outside, exactly as Roy had predicted. They were looking for an old farmer with a hunting rifle. Instead, they found a ghost. Roy moved through the smoke like a predator that had spent 20 years perfecting the art of invisible death. These weren't soldiers, just thugs with guns who'd never faced someone trained to kill in the dark, trained to move without sound, trained to end lives with surgical precision. The first guard went down to a silent throat strike, his body carefully lowered to prevent noise. The second was eliminated with Roy's combat knife, the blade finding its mark with muscle memory earned in 100 similar encounters. Roy left the bodies positioned naturally, creating the illusion that they'd taken cover rather than been eliminated. By 8:15 p.m., Roy had neutralized 4 of the 6 exterior guards without raising an alarm. The remaining cartel members were trapped inside the silo, believing they were under siege by a superior force rather than being systematically eliminated by a single operator. Roy reached the silo and found Liam exactly where he'd seen him through the binoculars, tied to a chair in the upper level, terrified but unharmed. The boy's eyes went wide when he saw his grandfather emerge from the darkness like something out of a nightmare, face painted with combat camouflage and moving with lethal purpose. "Grandpa, how did you?" "Stay quiet, son." Roy cut the ropes with his combat knife, the same blade that had seen action in 3 different wars. "Hide in that grain bin and don't come out until I call for you. No matter what you hear, no matter how long it takes, you stay hidden until you hear my voice." Liam had never heard that tone from his grandfather before, command authority that brooked no argument, the voice of a man who'd given life and death orders in places where hesitation meant body bags. This wasn't his gentle grandfather anymore. This was someone else entirely, someone dangerous and competent and absolutely terrifying. "Grandpa, what were you?" Roy looked at his grandson with eyes that had seen too much death and caused too much of it. "Someone who should have been left alone, son. Now hide." El Lobo was waiting in the main floor of the silo, his remaining men flanking him with weapons drawn. Roy stepped into the moonlight streaming through the broken windows, hands empty but ready, every muscle coiled for action. "Roy Carson," El Lobo said in accented English that carried the weight of years and hatred. "The ghost of Kandahar. I should have killed you when I had the chance. You were just a scared kid then, Miguel. 19 years old, crying for your mother when we pulled you out of that cave. I gave you mercy because you reminded me of my own son. And look how that mercy repaid you. Your grandson will die because you were weak." Roy's laugh was cold as winter wind across a graveyard. "You made one mistake, Miguel. Just one. But it's going to cost you everything." "What mistake?" "You brought a war to my land. And you forgot who I used to be." The fight was brief and brutal. El Lobo was younger, faster, and motivated by years of hatred. But Roy had something his opponent lacked, the absolute certainty that comes from protecting blood, combined with 2 decades of close-quarters combat experience. Roy's combat knife found its mark in El Lobo's shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon clattering across the concrete floor. The remaining cartel soldiers moved to intervene, but Roy had positioned himself so that El Lobo's body blocked their line of fire. "Your men are zip-tied to fence posts," Roy said, pressing the knife against El Lobo's throat. "Your operation is finished. Your vehicles are disabled. You have exactly one choice: take your people and leave. Don't come back to my land. Don't come back to Texas. Forget the Carson Ranch exists." Roy helped El Lobo to his feet, supporting the wounded man with the same hands that had just defeated him. Even now, even after everything, He chose mercy over murder. Some lessons from Martha's church had taken deeper root than he'd realized. Why? El Lobo gasped, clutching his shoulder. Why not kill me? Because my grandson doesn't need to see his grandfather become a killer. He's seen enough tonight. Roy released El Lobo and stepped back, his knife still ready but no longer threatening. You have 10 minutes to collect your men and leave. If I see any of you again, mercy won't be an option. Sheriff Maddox arrived at sunrise to find 6 cartel operatives zip-tied to fence posts with military precision, their weapons stacked neatly beside them like a police evidence display. Roy and Liam sat on the porch steps, sharing coffee and watching the sun rise over the desert, looking like nothing more than a grandfather and grandson enjoying a quiet morning. Roy, what the hell happened here? Took back what was mine. Maddox examined the restrained men, noting the professional restraint techniques and the fact that all of them were alive and relatively unharmed. How many did you leave breathing? Roy sipped his coffee, the cup steady in hands that had killed men just hours before. All of them. Figured it was better to send a message than start a war. And what message was that? That some people should be left alone. The sheriff looked at the cartel members, then at Roy, trying to reconcile the mild-mannered farmer he'd known for 20 years with a tactical operator who'd single-handedly dismantled a professional kidnapping operation. You know I have to file a report on this, Roy. Federal case, cartel involvement, firearms discharge. They kidnapped my grandson, Tom. Everything else was self-defense and citizen's arrest. You'll find their weapons were never fired at civilians, no property damage beyond what they caused, no excessive force used in the apprehension of suspects. Maddox nodded slowly. He'd seen enough crime scenes to know the difference between a massacre and a surgical operation. This was definitely surgical, the work of someone who knew exactly how much force to use and when to stop. As Maddox loaded the cartel members into his vehicles, Roy watched from the porch with the satisfaction of a job completed. Los Hermanos Sangrientos would spread the word, the Carson Ranch was off limits. There were easier targets, places without ghosts protecting them. Later that morning, after the sheriff had left and the ranch had returned to its normal quiet, Liam walked past Roy's old footlocker. The lid was open, revealing medals and patches from military units he'd never heard of. One photograph caught his attention, a younger Roy in desert fatigues, standing with a group of hard-faced men who looked like they'd stepped out of an action movie. The patch on their uniforms read Ghost Team 4, and underneath, in smaller text, Death Before Dishonor. Grandpa, Liam said quietly, holding up the photograph, what were you really? Roy closed the footlocker and put his arm around his grandson's shoulders. In the morning light, he looked like what he'd always been, a weathered farmer who loved his land and his family. But Liam would never again see him as just a grandfather. Just someone who should have been left alone, son. Just someone who loves his family enough to do whatever's necessary to protect them. Roy looked out over his land. 40 years of peaceful farming that had been interrupted by one night of war. The cartel would remember what happened here, and they'd tell others. The Carson Ranch would remain quiet, a place where old soldiers could tend their crops and love their grandchildren without interference from those who chose violence as a way of life. Will they come back? No, son. They won't be back. Liam studied his grandfather's face, seeing new lines around the eyes, a certain hardness that hadn't been there before. How can you be sure? Roy smiled, and for just a moment, Liam caught a glimpse of the operator who'd earned the call sign reaper in places whose names were still classified. Because some lessons only need to be taught once. The cartel had learned something that day that Roy Carson had hoped they'd never need to know. Farmers can be warriors, grandfathers can be ghosts, and some men never really leave the war behind. They just wait for the right reason to remember who they used to be. And family was always the right reason. Subscribe for more incredible true stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. What would you do to protect your family? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that notification bell.